time I ever visited Vietnam was in 2014. This was a 2-week trip organized by my favorite tour company, Go Ahead. My special relationship with this country began half a century ago in the 1960s. The American War in Vietnam affected me as it did millions of other men of draft age. I was determined not to participate in this conflict that I viewed as illegal, immoral, and unwinnable. One option I briefly considered was to enlist in the Navy or some other branch that could guarantee an assignment somewhere other than Vietnam. From the mid-1960s to the early 70s, I participated in numerous anti-war protests and marches in New York and Washington. With student and then teaching deferments, I managed to legally avoid being sent to Vietnam to fight in their vicious civil war. 50 years later, I was curious to finally get a glimpse of the country I had previously been so determined to stay away from. Our trip began in Ho Chi Minh City, which is often still referred to by its former name of Saigon. With over 8 million inhabitants, it's the largest city in the country and more populous than New York. The country has come a long way since the Civil War ended in 1975 with the victory of the Communist North over the military regime in the South. While still today under the rule of the Vietnamese Communist Party, in the mid-1980s, the country emerged from a decade of political and economic isolation. Since then, it has become one of the fastest growing countries in the world. With almost 100 million inhabitants, Vietnam today is the 15th most populous country in the world. It has rapidly evolved from a centrally planned agrarian economy to become one of Asia's most vibrant industrial, market-based economies. In the middle of the 19th century, French forces invaded Vietnam and held on to their Indochina colony until World War II. Some of the representational buildings here and elsewhere reflect this period of French colonization. The history of Vietnam dates back some 4,000 years. It was home to one of the oldest civilizations and earliest agricultural societies. For much of this time, Vietnam was ruled by China, its much larger neighbor to the north, with which it has fought many wars. Street vendors are visible everywhere, as are colorful fruit, vegetable, and flower markets. What is immediately evident to any visitor is the large number of motorcycles that dominate the streets here and throughout the country. This reflects an intermediate stage of development, as the dominant mode of transportation, which used to be bicycle, is now thoroughly motorized. In time, automobiles will replace the motorbikes that currently clog the city's streets. It was surprising to see as many as 3 or more people on a motorcycle, sometimes including several kids without a helmet or other protection. We passed a number of traditional rice paddies on our drive to the Mekong Delta town of Kai Bay. There we boarded a motorized sampan that took us through the winding tributaries of the upper Mekong River. This huge delta region, which is clearly visible from space, extends for over 15,000 square miles in the southwestern part of the country. This portion of the delta is like a floating market, known for its locally grown produce that often hangs from bamboo poles over the market's boats. This is Vietnam's most productive region for agriculture and aquaculture. It was fascinating to catch a fleeting glimpse of people going about their daily lives from the vantage point of our river tour boat. lunch stop was at a beautifully shaded restaurant operated by one of the local fruit plantation owners. In addition to the great Vietnamese cooking, we sampled some tropical fruit that I had never even seen before. The region boasts a large offshore fishing fleet, but most of the country's fishery actually comes from farm-raised aquaculture, which has been growing steadily. Not surprisingly, nightlife in Saigon was a lot wilder than it is today in communist Ho Chi Minh City. There are plenty of places to go for late-night dancing and loud music, but people on our tour preferred to visit a rooftop restaurant to enjoy the live music and nighttime views of the sprawling city. The first time we had to squarely confront the painful legacy of America's Vietnam War was during our visit to the Cu Chi tunnels. Located in the northern suburbs of Ho Chi Minh City, this vast network of tunnels and underground rooms was originally built during the war with the French and later expanded during the American occupation in the 1960s. Well-hidden trapdoors scattered around the countryside provided access to the 75-mile-long tunnel network, which features cramped living spaces, meeting rooms, field hospitals, kitchens, and weapons storage. This 75-mile complex served as a staging area for the 1968 Tet Offensive, which finally turned American public opinion against the war. From Ho Chi Minh City, we flew to Da Nang, then took a bus to the city of Hoi An. This city is in the center of the country, about halfway between Hanoi in the north and Ho Chi Minh City in the south. Hoi An, a medium-sized city of around 120,000, has a number of traditional Buddhist temples and a well-preserved old part of town. I was most intrigued by the large outdoor market, which extends for many blocks. This is a great place to observe everyday Vietnamese life for farmers, sellers, and shoppers. 500 years ago, Hoi An was the most important trading port on the South China Sea. Today, agriculture accounts for only 15% of Vietnam's economy, way behind the service and industrial sectors. Still, the country is the world's largest producer of cashew nuts and black pepper, and the world's second largest exporter of rice and coffee. Later, I had a chance to experience Vietnamese cuisine in a cooking class, where I had a hand in preparing some local dishes. About 3/4 of all Vietnamese don't follow any particular organized religion. About 12% of the population identifies itself as Buddhist, while less than 10% adhere to various Christian denominations. While generally shunning organized religion, many Vietnamese believe in the supernatural and spiritualism, where favorable medical or financial outcomes can be influenced by prayer, good deeds, and charitable donations. Like many others in Asia, Vietnamese culture harmonizes family and community values above individualism. Key cultural symbols include the Vietnamese dragon, which is derived from crocodile and snake imagery. Other prominent images that are revered are the turtle, the buffalo, the horse, and a holy bird representing Vietnam's national mother. For average people here, life is certainly hard, as it is everywhere. Like Cuba and China, the communist regime here controls virtually every aspect of life in the country, not just its politics, the economy and defense, but also education, healthcare, the arts, tourism, and the media. These hybrid communist capitalist nations are in countries without a strong tradition of individual freedoms. Until the middle of the 20th century, most Vietnamese were landless peasants, working long hours for minimal subsistence. Today's citizens are better off than they ever were, with low unemployment, a stable government, a social safety net, and a diverse economy with enviable growth rates. It remains to be seen how any of these countries might eventually transition to greater individual freedom and democracy. There are a number of successful examples in Eastern Europe that might someday serve as models. From Hoi An, we continued by bus over the Hai Van Pass to Hue. This pass is renowned for its sweeping views of the South China Sea, but we couldn't see very much due to the rainy weather. Hue was Vietnam's former capital city from the early 19th century to the end of World War II. Hue's main tourist attraction is the enormous 19th century citadel surrounded by 6 miles of thick walls and a moat. They encompass the imperial city with its many palaces, temples, and shrines. The emperor's living quarters were in the so-called Forbidden Purple City, modeled on the Chinese emperor's Forbidden City in Beijing. The imperial city was oriented to face the Perfume River. Construction began in 1804 by thousands of laborers. It would eventually contain hundreds of buildings, gated courtyards, pavilions, and palaces. The imperial city was the seat of power for the Nguyen dynasty until the imposition of the French protectorate in the 1880s. Major damage occurred during fighting between the French army and Vietnamese freedom fighters in 1947, destroying many of the major structures, including the Imperial Palace. In 1968, during America's war here, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers captured Hue as part of their Tet Offensive. After they installed anti-aircraft guns on the citadel, U.S. warplanes bombed the site. After the Battle of Hue, out of 160 buildings, only 10 major sites there still remained. 3 miles from the imperial city is the pagoda of the Celestial Lady, Tien Mu. The 7-story structure is the tallest pagoda in Vietnam. Emperor Tu Duc ruled Vietnam for 35 years, longer than any other emperor of the Nguyen dynasty. Although blessed with over 100 wives and concubines, the poor fellow never managed to father a son. Long before his death in 1883, he began planning his tomb and actually moved into the tomb's palace buildings for the final years of his life. Despite all the time and expense that went into creating his elaborate tomb, he's actually buried somewhere else. To ensure that the location was kept secret, the 200 workers who buried their emperor were all beheaded after they returned from burying him. The site remains a secret to this day. The tomb of Emperor Khai Dinh is the last of the great imperial tombs. Begun before his death in 1925, it was completed in 1931 after 11 years of construction. He was extremely unpopular due to his close collaboration with the French. Near the top of the building with his tomb are some palatial rooms with intricately designed glass and porcelain decorations. One of these ornate rooms contains an altar to him and a statue of himself made in France. Our one-day stay in Hanoi, Vietnam's capital and its second largest city, was too short for me to get a really good feel for the place. We visited mostly historic sites associated with Ho Chi Minh, who for 24 years served as the Vietnam Republic's first president. After he led the War of Independence against the French, he then led a second war of liberation to end the American occupation and restore unity and peace to this war-torn country. Instead of living in the lavish presidential palace, which he only used for official receptions, Ho lived modestly behind the palace in a stilt house, where he could quietly pursue his governmental duties and passion for gardening. The Temple of Literature is dedicated to Confucius. Originally built 1,000 years ago, the extensive site also hosts the Imperial Academy, Vietnam's first national university. Beginning in the 11th century, students studied mainly Chinese literature, Chinese philosophy, and Chinese history. The high point of our day in Hanoi was a tour by pedicab through the oldest part of the city, the so-called Old Quarter. When the Old Quarter was established 1,000 years ago under the Li dynasty, it consisted of 36 streets, each one named for a particular trade or guild that worked here. Some of the street names have been kept, such as Bamboo Wares Street, Copper Wares Street, and Sails Street. The name hasn't changed, but instead of selling sails for fishing boats, the street today is dominated by shops selling cakes and candy. Hoa Lo Prison was built by the French occupiers in the 1880s. During America's Vietnam War, it was used to imprison captured American pilots, who sarcastically called it Hanoi Hilton. Prisoners suffered severe abuse and torture, as did many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers captured by the South Vietnamese. About 100 miles from Hanoi is Ha Long Bay, a popular destination for short cruises and overnight stays on one of the many well-appointed tour boats. What makes the bay so attractive are the thousands of islands. These range in size from simple limestone boulders to expansive tree-covered islands extending for thousands of acres. A few of the islands are actually hollow with enormous caves. We visited the largest such cave, Hang Dao Go, which has 3 large chambers containing impressive stalactites and stalagmites. Some of the larger islands in the bay now have villages with tourist hotels and beaches that threaten to overwhelm the area's fragile ecosystem. This was a great place to spend our last night in Vietnam. The next morning, we had a sumptuous breakfast before driving back to Hanoi for our flight to Cambodia. During our 2 days in Cambodia, we stayed in the city of Siem Reap. Today it serves as the busy gateway for millions of tourists visiting the dozen nearby temple sites. One of the largest and most impressive of these is Angkor Thom, which literally means Great City. Surrounded by a moat and 25-foot-high walls extending for miles, the site was the last and most enduring capital city of the Khmer Empire. Established in the late 12th century by King Jayavarman VII, it's estimated that upwards of 100,000 people once lived here. Satellite imagery indicates that Angkor was once the largest pre-industrial center in the world. It was a French naturalist who effectively rediscovered the Angkor site in 1860. This led France to seize Cambodia as a protectorate and take control of the ruins in 1863. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the French financed urgently needed restoration efforts to push back the jungle and stabilize these historic ruins. No artifacts or written records have been recovered from the Angkor sites, which contain both Hindu and later Buddhist temples. Banyan trees are a fig species. When their seeds fall on tree branches or human structures, they germinate and send out roots going down to the ground, thus enveloping and often strangling the host tree. At the center of the city stands the Bayon, a richly decorated Buddhist temple built toward the end of the 12th century. It's characterized by some 200 serenely smiling stone faces on its many towers and clustered around its central peak. Their significance is unclear. They could depict a kind of Buddhist saint or some semi-divine presence of the king himself. The site contains many galleries with low-relief stone sculptures depicting everything from everyday life to crowded battle scenes. In the evening, we watched a performance of the ancient art of Apsara dance, much like it's depicted on the Angkor temple walls. The dancers wear silk tunics and sequin tops into which they are sewn before each performance. Training lasts 10 to 12 years, often beginning at age 7. Our final day in Cambodia was spent exploring the temple complex of Angkor Wat. Built on a 400-acre site, it claims to be the largest religious monument in the world, more than triple the size of Vatican City. It was originally built in the early 12th century as a Hindu temple to the god Vishnu. Toward the end of the 12th century, it was gradually transformed into a Buddhist temple. The quadratic site is bordered by a 3-mile-long wall and moat. The main gallery, lined with friezes, constitute, according to one scholar, the greatest known linear arrangement of stone carving. The temple was built using more than 5 million sandstone blocks, some weighing over a ton each. The stone was hauled from a quarry more than 20 miles from the site, then put in place with the help of elephants, ropes, pulleys, and bamboo scaffolding. With the fall of Angkor in the 15th century, its role as capital city ended, though various communities, including settlers from Japan, continued to live here well into the 17th century. We spent part of our last afternoon in Cambodia cruising Tonle Sap Lake. This is a seasonally inundated freshwater lake that connects to the Mekong River. Together, they form the central part of a complex hydrological system. The size of the lake varies monthly from about 1,000 to 6,000 square miles, depending on the time of year and the intensity of the monsoons. Many of the fishermen who work here are ethnic Vietnamese, who have been fishing here for generations. They left during Pol Pot's murderous regime from 1975 to 1979, but have long since returned. An impromptu visit to a village at the end of the cruise provided yet another glimpse into the everyday life of the people here. This is something that tourists on an organized tour rarely get to see. Young Buddhist monks at work or kids playing and horsing around. Our farewell Cambodian dinner included some live music. From Cambodia we flew to Bangkok, Thailand's capital with over 8 million inhabitants. Since I spent less than a day there before flying back to New York, I wasn't able to see very much of the city, one of the world's top tourist destinations. What was evident during this brief visit is a somewhat haphazard cityscape. Beneath one of the urban highways there were several activities occurring simultaneously, including a demonstration against the government alongside a bazaar of street vendors. The one site we visited was Jim Thompson's house. He was an ex-architect and a retired U.S. Army officer who remained in Bangkok after World War II. Thompson is credited with almost single-handedly saving Thailand's vital silk industry from extinction. In 1958, he recycled and reassembled 6 country houses on his downtown estate to create a truly unique mansion. Thompson filled his home, now a museum, with precious art objects such as Ming vases, Belgian glass, Cambodian carvings, and Burmese statues. At the time of his mysterious disappearance in 1967, Jim Thompson was one of the most famous Americans living in Asia. While visiting friends in Malaysia, he went out for a walk by himself and was never seen again. My brief stay in Bangkok only whetted my appetite. I hope to be able to return to Thailand before long and experience more of this beautiful, fascinating country.